Hey guys, this is Chad with Thriving Canine, and I want to just go over briefly the different types of training collars that are available. And I'm going to start with just your basic collar, your basic training, your basic regular old collar, if you look. So basically it's just like a belt that goes around the dog's neck. Some of them, they have different ways of connecting, and there's different types, but more or less it just goes around the dog's neck and nothing happens to it. It doesn't constrict or do anything. It has no moving mechanism to it. That's just your regular plain collar. So not technically a training collar, just a regular collar. Sometimes that's all you need with some dogs, but generally you're going to need something more, because one thing is, say if this is the dog's head, it just goes over their neck. But because it doesn't constrict at all, it can slip out. Some dogs, they can back out of it and it can come over their head. So even if you put it on really snug, sometimes they can still get out of it. So that's one concern. But as far as functionality training goes, here, if you guys can see here, if I put it around my forearm, when I pull, all the pressure is going on this other side. So, which on the dog would probably be their throat. If this is the dog's head, and you're pulling like this, all that pressure goes directly onto the throat or onto the opposite side of the collar. Okay? So, but if you just have a little puppy, or you want to probably just put a collar on them and let them just get used to wearing the collar. If the breeder didn't do that, sometimes just having a collar on at all bothers them. So before you even worry about putting a leash on, just let them just wear a regular collar like this. It's also very important because it can carry their tags. You have their tags on it. Okay? Now, if you're starting with just a young puppy or a small dog or a dog that really has no training or really has an aversion to even having anything on their neck, things of that nature, then you may want to actually just start with a harness that goes around their body. So come here. I'll use little Wilson here as a model. So I put one on him. It's not fit perfectly. I think it's a little too tight right now, but I just wanted to show you guys. But you can see as it just comes through his chest and around his legs and onto the back. So when it pulls, it's just pulling against the chest, so it's not pulling on the throat. So, or if you have a dog that has some kind of injury or a really sensitive throat or something like that, you may also want to use a harness. Typically for me, the only time I really use harnesses is sometimes just some little dogs, that's all they really need. Or if I'm starting a brand new puppy and just going out for their first few walks, I would probably use a harness just to reduce any aversion they have to having something around their neck. Okay? And now just a little comment on harnesses. I have had some people, actually quite frequently, people will say something like, yeah, I use the harness because I have more control with the harness. That's pretty much impossible to have more control with the harness, because it gives you the least amount of leverage. It actually leverages the ability of the dog to pull more. That's what harnesses are designed for, when you want the dog to have mobility of their head for sniffing or scent work or something like that, or when you actually want dogs to pull, sled dogs, for example. But I think what happens is sometimes with the harness, people feel they have more control. What they really have is less choking, because it's not on the dog's throat. So the dog may still be pulling, but they're not choking and gagging, so people notice. So psychologically, the people feel like there's less pulling because they're not being disturbed by the dog's choking. That's one possibility. The other thing is, because dogs have a natural, it's called opposition reflex. So which means they will have a natural resistance to pressure. So if you pull on the leash, they pull more. So that's why it's so common to see dogs pulling. For one, they just want to go forward, so they're interested. But that pressure on the release triggers a reflex for the dog to actually pull more. But because the harness is less noticeable to the dog than a collar for a lot of dogs, sometimes they actually do pull less in the sense that they have less resistance to it because they notice it less. So that opposition reflex is less. But when it comes time to actually start training the dog and teaching the dog to not pull on the leash or to start communicating to the dog with the leash, typically you're going to find the harness doesn't work nearly as well. And you definitely have less leverage, therefore less physical control with the harness. Okay? But anyway, harness, if you're using a harness and your dog responds really well to rewards and you don't need a lot of physical leverage, maybe that's all you ever need, okay? But that's a harness, okay? So now we're going to really move on to beyond the regular collar and beyond the harness when we have to get into training collars, which generally means collars that give us more control, more physical leverage, and also that we can get around the dog's neck that won't slip off their head, okay? Hopefully you guys are with me so far. Okay, so next on the list, this is one that I use a lot. Typically, this is my first go-to. If I'm starting with a puppy or a young dog or something, I will go to what's called a Martingale collar or a limited slip collar, or they have different names for it. But typically, Martingale collar is the slang that you're going to hear for it. Now, if you see here, it looks like a regular collar, except for it has this little piece of chain here, so it can tighten sorry, the tag's in the way. So it can tighten a little bit like this. Now, if you see here, just like I did with the regular collar, if I put this around my forearm and I pull, let me get the dang tag out of the way. Okay? If you guys can see that. But now it's not putting all the, you can see it's squeezing my forearm, you see, rather than just putting all the pressure. With the regular collar, I was feeling the pressure on this bone over here. And with this one, I can feel it actually squeezing down on the muscle on my forearm. Okay, so what that means is, on the dog, rather than all that pressure going on the dog's throat, it's squeezing like this. So we're trying to get the pressure onto this muscle on the side of the neck. Dogs have very strong muscle here on the side of the neck, and we're trying to get the pressure there, therefore off the throat. And it's also, because it's touching more, and also the little chain is making a noise, that's getting the dog's attention more, the dog feels it more, pays attention to it more, and whatever pressure you're using is going on the muscle, therefore protecting the throat. Okay? So that's your limited slip collar or your Martingale collar. This can be put on puppies, this can be put on any dog, unless the dog has something so severe going on that you need to use a harness. Okay? So really no harm in using this at all. It's nothing. This is not a controversial collar. Even most positive reinforcement trainers, most of them anyway, are even okay with using this. Okay? So that's your Martingale collar. Now, I want to compare that to, a lot of you are probably familiar with a choke chain or a slip collar or a slip lead or things like that, which this one's made out of chain. Some of them are made out of nylon or different materials, but you'll see that the chain tightens and releases. Okay? So if I was to put that also around my forearm, same concept. I feel a squeezing action around the muscle on my arm rather than just on the opposite side of the pulling. But one thing to be aware of with this is, look here, I can make this go all the way down around my finger. And so no matter how big of a choke chain you get, or a slip lead or choke chain, sometimes they're made out of nylon material, like I said, so it's not necessarily a chain, but it's just a slip collar. The problem is it slips all the way. So the concern is actually choking the dog. It might actually choke the dog, or you might be driving the pressure too deep in, which we want to avoid. So that's my only concern. That's really my concern about choke chains. Or you would never want to leave a dog unattended with a choke chain, because if it gets snagged on something, the dog could literally choke or strangle the dog. Okay, so we don't want to strangle the dog or choke the dog. If you're using it correctly, you want to have it set. Now, so notice here how when it corrects and it falls loose. So you want to have it set so that this chain falls loose, and you're just popping the leash and then relaxing it, and it falls loose. If you're doing that, this is an okay tool to use. It's very similar to the Martingale collar. Like I said, though, just be aware that the pressure can go too deep, driving pressure down internally too much, or actually cutting off the blood supply or cutting off the air supply, and we do not want to do that. We do not want to do that. Okay? So, now, moving on up. Now, if we've done a good job training our dog, we've been using our rewards, we've started with our regular collar, Martingale collar harness, what have you, and we're moving along, things are going okay, maybe not okay, but if you feel like you're needing more leverage, typically what happens is when the dogs are getting distracted and people feel like they're just pulling and tugging and popping and pulling and tugging and popping over and it's just not really getting through to the dog, then we need more leverage. Right? Because there's either the concern of it's just not working, it's frustrating for you, it's frustrating for the dog, possibly it's injuring the dog if you're using too much pressure. Then that's where we move on to a prong collar. Not all dogs need to move on to a prong collar, but in my experience, a lot of dogs do really well with the prong collar, and it gives the people a peace of mind, and they actually get a more enjoyable walk, a more controllable walk, and therefore the dog gets walked more often. So in that sense, prong collar can be a very positive tool, but it's also very, very controversial. So if you see it, it functions like the Martingale collar did in that it closes like this, okay? And it won't choke because it's a limited slip. It only closes this little bit, but it has these prongs on it, so you get a lot more leverage. Now if you see here, you can see again, it's squeezing on my arm. I'm feeling it here and not so much here, which would be the dog's throat. So in getting that same squeezing action, but because it has these teeth, it's a lot more effective. And with much less pressure, it's just more noticeable to me. But and I would suggest if you're thinking of this, that you put one on yourself and give it a try. And just, give it a good, decent tug and see how it feels. It's not nearly as wicked as it looks. It looks so wicked, and that scares people sometimes. And that's also what makes it controversial. But you'll find that, to me, that it doesn't really hurt. I'm feeling it. It's getting my attention, and I was jerking that pretty hard. You're not trying to hurt the dog. It's just a way of getting the dog's attention. And again, keeping pressure off the throat, right? We're trying to teach them to not pull and to pay attention, right? And to not damage the throat. So what this does. Hey, Woody, come here. Sorry about Come here, Woody. Sorry about the background noise. Woody's playing around in his pool full of bottles. Okay, good dogs. Here, why don't you guys lay down? Good boy. Okay, so anyhow, that's your prong collar. I use them a lot. I find that probably 80% of the dogs, these work really well. You do not have to use them, but you don't have to get freaked out by all the controversy that's out there either once you understand it. If you understand it well, there's not a reason for it to be nearly as controversial as it is, but it should be used appropriately. You don't just strap this on a dog and start jerking away, right? You teach the dog what you're wanting, what you're communicating to them, starting with a collar with less leverage and then moving on to this only if you need to. I think that to me is about as fair as we can be, okay? But that's your prong collar. Now, this will be the last one of the day. This is, there's a head harness. This one's a gentle leader. There's different brands out there, but if you see, let's say, if I put this part on, it goes over the dog's neck, and say if this is the dog's face, this is a head harness. So what this does is it goes over the bridge of the dog's nose or over the dog's muzzle, like if that's their mouth. Then this is around their neck just to hold it in place. This goes over the dog's muzzle. The leash attaches down here, so it will pull the dog's muzzle around, so it pulls their face around. So for sure, there's a lot more leverage there because I'm feeling that twist my wrist. And, like you grab a person and twist their wrist, right? That gives you can control a person just by grabbing their hand and controlling their wrist. And the dog, that would be turning their head around, right? So it's going to go over the dog's nose like so, and then pull from underneath and pull the head around. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you guys. I'm not a fan of these. I don't really like them. I almost never use them. But I have had clients that use them and have success with them because for sure it gives leverage. It probably gives the most leverage out of all. And ironically, the ironic thing about this is that the positive reinforcement trainers, I'm going to put positive in quotes there because when people are claiming to be positive trainers, that means they train with positive reinforcement. This is definitely not positive reinforcement. This is physical pressure, physical leverage, physical force being used to twist the dog's head. And it's very aversive. And it's making it so when the dog tries to pull that it doesn't feel good, and you have leverage to pull the dog and tell them to not pull. So it's negative reinforcement, it's punishment, for sure. So don't be fooled by people trying to tell you this is positive. And for some dogs, this is actually the most aversive tool because they just don't like having it on their face. They don't like having their head turned around, right? And if the dog, and it's gentle, it's supposed to be done in a gentle fashion, just a gentle pull like this, pull and release, pull and release. Supposed to be. But if the dog, if you're giving the dog any length of leash at all, and they run off and hit the end of the leash, boom, it's going to yank and twist their head quite harshly. So in that case, it's no longer gentle at all. And personally, I'm concerned of the dog's head being twisted like that you might having some internal damage going on, right? If you think of it in football, that would be like face masking. You're not allowed to grab a guy by the helmet and twist his face, right? So just be aware of that. If you are going to use these, they definitely give more leverage to pull the dog's face. But this is kind of designed for a horse, which has a huge, strong neck. With the dog, I'm a little concerned, but I'm also concerned with that they just don't like having it on their face. So they're being punished the whole time if they just don't like having it on. So even if the leash is relaxed, they still have it on their face. And I've seen a lot of dogs just constantly trying to get it off their face. I've even seen a dog scuff his nose up on the concrete trying to rub and get it off. Okay, so that being said, right? So I'm not a huge fan of it. Also, I'll give you another reason. Another reason I'm not a huge fan of it is because the dog's so aware of when it's on constantly that when you take it off, they have a huge awareness of it being off, which leads to sometimes you take it off and then the dog's behavior changes or they go back to pulling or what have you. So it's a little harder to wean off of it, okay? Like I say, if you're using this and it's working for you, great. Or if you want to try it, great. Just be very careful that you don't let the dog run off and hit the end of the leash too hard with one of these on. That would be the only really bad thing about it. Otherwise, it might work out great for some people, okay? But there you go. Now you have an overview of the types of training collars that are available to you. This video is not meant for the general public. It's meant for people taking my courses. So I'm just giving you my opinion. I try to be as factual about this as possible while also giving you a little bit of just my opinion about it. I'm not against anything if it works for you, okay? I'm not against anything that works. Sometimes it just doesn't work as good as people think, or people don't understand the big picture where we're going with this. So in my classes, most of the time, what you're going to see is either a Martingale collar or a Prong Collar. Those would be the two main collars out of all this that you will see most of the time. If I'm starting with a little puppy, you're probably going to see a harness at first and then move to probably a Martingale collar. If we're out in the world, we're going to use a Martingale collar so that the puppy, don't have to worry about the puppy getting away. If I was just introducing a puppy to the collar in my backyard or in the house or something, I would probably just use a regular flat buckle collar. But once we really move on, that's just beginning. Once we move on, we're really into training. Most of the time it's going to be a Martingale collar or a Prong Collar. Hopefully you guys have a good understanding of all the general collars that are out there. If you have any questions or anything, you can ask me, give me an email, call me, text me, ask me after class or at the beginning of class, because sometimes if it's a good question, maybe I'll answer to the whole class. They might all be interested in it. Okay? So hopefully that gave you guys some good information about the options on training collars. Thank you very much. Bye.